Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Scott.
I'm Shatay, and we're the Hazes.
Welcome to the Love Haze podcast, where we believe that healing and wholeness are not just destinations.
That's right, y'all. We believe they're a journey, and here on the Love Haze, we talk about how to navigate through it.
That's right. Have you ever tried to play with your shadow when you were a kid?
A little bit.
Do you notice that as adults, we don't even acknowledge our shadows anymore?
Mm-hmm.
But they're still there.
Yeah.
And today, we want to talk a little bit about how to come out of the shadows. Let's get right into this thing. It's going to be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go. Welcome to our Black Love journey. We getting into it.
Here we go.
So, shadow work.
It's a thing.
It's a thing. Where do we get this topic from?
Well, my therapist, I've definitely become one of those people that starts conversation or start sentences with. My therapist said it came up in therapy for me some months ago, and it was like, yeah, kind of in passing, like I think it would be useful to start doing for you to do shadow work or not to start. She was like, the shadow work that we're doing. It's kind of she's kind of threw it in there, and I was like, that's interesting. So it's something that I've just kind of seen or been aware of the past couple of months. This idea of like, we know that one of my hangups, central traumas, I know that's not necessarily a thing, is like this idea of people pleasing and perfectionism, and like how I'm always trying to like portray like the most perfect versions of myself when really that's just not humanity. And so I think it's just like understanding where that came from and, why we do that and how to disrupt it. We just saw The Woman King, which is so good.
It is.
And I felt like there was just this idea of that, like how your past coming back almost to haunt you, quote unquote. The parts of yourselves that you don't want to acknowledge, that you just want to bury. But when you actually accept them, the power, the strength, how it changes the course of your story or experience. So I just thought it'd be something interesting that we could just unpack together with folks that, are already doing this work or are just hearing about it for the first time. Would love to know from you, Mr. Mental Health Professional.
I always know when you say that, there's about to be some stuff.
I mean, break it down for us. What does it mean to do shadow work? What is a shadow?
So our shadow is our inner shadow. Our shadow is like those parts of ourselves that we have kind of convinced ourselves that are not acceptable to the world. And we try to shrink them back or we try to hide them because we feel like it's not a part of like our ideal self.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I had to go back even when I started therapy and do some work around like understanding the difference between reparenting my inner child and doing shadow work.
Yeah.
So reparenting our inner children is more about like revisiting those things that we didn't get, that, the smaller versions of us really needed. And it became like things that we don't really talk about when we're older. And reparenting our inner child is going back and giving the little you like that love or that acceptance that you needed, versus our shadows being those parts of us that are actually us, that we have convinced ourselves that is not acceptable to the world. Like if we have convinced ourselves that we talk too much, right? And we try our best like not to say more words, and somebody comes along and says something about making sure that you don't write too much or that you don't say too much. It can be triggering for your shadow self because that's already a part of you that you've been trying to hide. Because I know that I talk too much, right? So I try my best to use like less words. And then somebody comes and reminds me of that shadow that I've already been trying to hide. So that's really the difference. But that the shadow work is actually us learning to accept those parts of us that are really who we are.
Yeah.
Those parts of us that and it makes me think of like, at what point did I convince myself that I wasn't good enough? Like, at what point did I tell myself that I needed to shrink? in order to be acceptable.
Yeah, it makes me think actually, at what point were we taught that that part of ourselves wasn't acceptable or that
Hmm.
part what didn't deserve light? For me, the only thing I can really think of is like maybe mistakes that we made when we were younger. Maybe we would want to repress those experiences. But even then, if we're talking about shadow, if there really is just a yin to our yang, a darker side of
Hmm.
us, were those really mistakes? Were those like conscious choices? And is that okay? You know what I mean? Like, I guess
Yeah,
we're assigning meaning, like this part of us is good and this part of us is bad. Who
yeah.
decides that for us?
And so that's what I was going to point out, actually. And I think that language matters, especially for us when we're younger and we're developing and that type of thing. Because the language that you used was like mistakes that we've made. But
Hmm.
was it really a mistake, or
Right.
was it just how you showed up in the world and what the reaction that you got from the world or from the social interaction was that it wasn't favorable?
Yeah.
So that's how we learn behavior, right? We go out, we interact with the world, and we basically gauge, we reconcile the books on what feels acceptable, what we got positive feedback from, and what we got negative feedback from. And in our minds, we'll process it as, well, that was a mistake
Hmm.
because people didn't like it. And so I don't want to do that again. And
Mm.
so we process it as a mistake. And then we shrink those parts of ourselves back because this is not socially acceptable.
Mm.
That shadow work then tells us that it wasn't a mistake. Somehow you've learned to shrink back, and you have to honor that part of yourself that you feel like talks too much or does too much in social
Hmm.
interactions or does things that you may feel like are socially unacceptable, because the long part of this conversation I think we'll get more into is like, do I really want to be acceptable to the world, or do I want to like be acceptable to me and be my optimal self even if I have to go by myself?
That I think is the root of it all. Like, how do we get to a place where we are accepting all the parts of us,
Hmm.
all of me? And I think that is when we talk about evolving to the highest versions of ourselves.
Hmm.
I wonder, can you even really do that if you've not even accepted all the other parts, or if we haven't loving past versions of ourselves, we had that conversation, or reparenting the inner child. There are
Hmm.
all these like layers to who we are as
Hmm.
humans and individuals, both human and divine. It's like, how do you accept the totality of that and still choose to show up?
And so it's an ongoing journey.
Hmm.
It is work that is constant, um, and really just it's never ending.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes and I want to be careful about. I know we use all these great phrases like evolving to the highest version of ourselves, and I want to make sure that we mix in there that healing and wholeness are definitely journeys, not
Hmm.
destinations.
Hmm.
So I don't think there ever be a time when I have evolved to the very highest version of
Hmm.
myself until I'm on the other side of the dirt.
Hmm.
Then it's done. But there's always work for us to be doing, and I think that as long as we accept that, then we'll be okay. But if I think that there is a point, that I should have arrived to, then that's when I start to beat myself up a little bit more.
Hmm. I don't think there's a point we should have arrived to. I think there are ongoing. It's never ending. To your
Hmm.
point, like
Hmm.
once I get to this version of self acceptance and my experience and my accomplishments, or not accomplishments in a superficial form of the word, but this amount of healing and this perspective and this enlightenment, then there will be another level to achieve. And so I
Yeah.
agree with you. Like I don't know that if there is a highest, and once we've reached it, then our work here is probably
Yeah.
probably done.
And I
If we ever whatever it is.
and I think that we reach like these intersections in life where like life is happening, and then there's this part of us that kind of runs into like our moral base or some other challenge that comes in our life, and we have to address it. And that kind of leads into the next question, like, how do we know when it's some shadow work that needs to be done?
That's a really good question because I wasn't able to call it out for myself. That I had a professional who was like, "This is actually what's needed to be done." I do recall in one of our early sessions, she was like, "What approach do you want to take? Do you want me to just be giving you tools to manage your experiences as they come, or do you want to dig deeper and understand your perspective around these experiences? Why some of these you're having some of these experiences?" And I was like, "Ooh, that one. I want to know
Hmm.
because I'm curious. I want to know why this is coming up for me."
Right.
And I think that is basically what it is. I can't say that I would have known that that's a thing. That's not something people are talking about. It's
Hmm.
not common knowledge. You even think the idea that there are parts of ourselves that are less than ideal and we should love them and acknowledge them, just even that idea feels provocative and not like anything we've ever been
Hmm.
taught before. It's kind of like, especially when you grow up in the church, it's like everybody's a sinner, you were born here a sinner, you came here, everybody's got
Hmm.
original sin, and you've got to repress and fight the
Hmm.
temptations to not like, just we're taught to repress
Yes.
negative sides of not repress, we're taught to reject. We are
Yeah.
literally taught to reject ourselves if
Hmm.
you grew up in the faith that we did. And yes, disclaimer, everybody's doing the best that they can with who they are at the time.
Hmm.
But how are you taught to reject and then all of a sudden come to like, oh, actually no, that is okay, and I am me, and I'm
Hmm.
just gonna show up, and that's just not the experience in our and for most folks in our community.
It is unlearning. It is those parts of the unlearning that we have to do. And for me, it's this idea that I is rooted in perfectionism and not wanting to be wrong, wanting to be like the SME, the subject matter expert on these things, even as it relates to like the work that we do. One of the hardest things for me to do regarding like accepting going to therapy was that I had to release myself from being a subject matter expert on even on me.
Hmm.
The only thing that I knew was that I had my own stuff,
Yeah.
that I needed to deal with, and even having to accept that, and to have to accept it on almost a daily, weekly basis, that there is yet more work to do on myself is difficult because this is what I do for a living. And so the story that I was telling myself was that how do you fix other people when you don't have it together,
Hmm.
right? And so I would shrink back those parts of myself that I thought were unacceptable, those thoughts that I was having, those things that I knew about myself, I hid them.
Hmm.
And I hid them and did other things to like pacify so that I didn't have to show the world that I was imperfect.
Hmm.
And that shadow work, for me was really about like learning to um, take those parts of me that I felt like were unacceptable and use them to better my practice, to
Hmm.
be able to show folks that even I am in process, even I am still doing this work. And we are. Like, I am not a group leader. I may be facilitating this conversation, but I'm facilitating based on the fact that I still have this work to do as well.
Hmm.
And even some of the shadow work that we have to do, some of the stuff that people do when they are hiding their shadows, is that you other people,
Hmm.
and we take some of those things that are unacceptable about ourselves, and we project them onto others, and we point them out in
Hmm.
other people when we're really hiding our stuff.
Hmm.
And that's part of the stuff that you do when you're hiding, basically like in the shadows. And it doesn't work for anybody.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting thought. As you were sitting here, as I was sitting here and listening to you say that, it was what comes to mind for me is one. I think that's one why the whole premise of the Love Haze podcast is not to be up here as teachers, is to be here as part of the figure outers.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're just sharing how we're processing our own journey, and to with the intent to let people know that they're not alone. Like whatever you're experiencing, we also are experiencing some version of that. The other thing that comes to mind is like, I don't think that you have to be perfect. I find it interesting, I guess, that you thought you would have to be perfect in order to help other people in this way. Because I think about my dance background, I can teach people to dance, but I will still always be a student of dance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? So I never really, I could teach you as much as I know, and the rest of it, I don't have any issues. For example, bringing in experts to teach master classes, and I'm taking a class with y'all. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
I guess that position, that perspective is interesting to me. Going back to though what we were taught in the church,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Exactly what I was about to reference.
it's it's kind of, I think we've seen both of it, and I don't know how to make sense of all of it coexisting. There, on the one hand, we were taught this sort of self rejection, and if to take it even a step further, like the amount of self-hate that I think our people have maybe sort of been taught from just like racial traumas, and then the type of Christian being taught the type of Christianity that they taught slaves to keep them subservient. Like
Mm-hmm.
we are up against all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea that we would somehow come to love and accept all the parts of us is revolutionary for a
Mm-hmm.
Black community, and it's gorgeous and could bring me to tears. But then also there are some examples in the Bible of people being used despite their
Mm-hmm.
flaws and mistakes. You think about Moses with the speaking impediment, but was called to lead, the people out of Egypt, right? The right
Mm-hmm.
story. Or you think about David. They say that
Mm-hmm.
story all the time. He had, took old boy's wife, slept with
Mm-hmm.
her,
No,
had him
old
killed,
boy.
had him killed. What's the name? Uriah had him killed. And
Mm-hmm.
but was still, God still called him a man after his own heart. Like, so there are examples of acceptance beyond
Mm-hmm.
these less ideal parts of ourselves, but there's this weird, we're also taught to
And I guess for
reject.
me, like I saw those examples in the Bible, but I didn't see those examples in real life because what I grew up seeing and being taught was like this hellfire and brimstone kind
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, religion where pastors had to be perfect. Anybody who was in a leadership position had to be
But we
perfect.
know that they were not.
And we knew that they were not. And we saw examples of them like falling. And I think that I processed that and saw myself as imperfect and was like, I can never lead anything
Mm.
because I'm not perfect. And these people are expected to be perfect. And so I can't do any of that. And so I saw the Bible, but then I saw what I was being taught. And I think that there's a part of me that has rejected those old teachings and just like, I want like real life application. Like
Mm-hmm.
what does it look like to be able to pivot from mistakes? What does it look like to accept the totality of your humanity
Mm-hmm.
and not have to hide? And to be able to find like your creativity and your expression and base your practice around being able to make mistakes and being able to pivot and teaching people how to really live and not to exist in fear,
Mm.
you
Or
know?
shame. How do we
Hmm.
how do we have a movement to just get rid of shame? Guess that's Brene Brown's calling, but still, like,
That's all of our calling. I'm not rejected. That's just her calling.
but she's doing all the research and the work on it. I'm
She's
not
doing the
called to
work on
research.
it.
That's
I don't want to research it. I just want to be a person who is a catalyst for people to understand that they can move
yeah.
like that, and also that the parts of you that you're trying to hide, it is the story that you should be telling for other people to be able to navigate their journeys. One of the reasons why I think Brene Brown is so renowned and so loved is because she uses like real life examples of her like her missteps and how she found her voice even in guilt and shame and being able to navigate all of those processes. And I think that we all have that level of the work, and it's about how you're supposed to impact the world with it. Like there's impact that we are supposed to have in our individual families so that they know that they are able to pivot and shift and, you know, show up and be in the game and maybe not get it right, but have credit and give yourself love for being able to be in the game and not be a person who's just talking about it, rather than shrinking back into the shadows, sitting in the bleachers, looking at other people and judging them, and knowing that, you don't want to be the person to do it. Show up in the space, be your whole self, and be able to pivot as you learn.
So I'm gonna bring us into the haze of that, because my very first thought is that's hard and that's scary and it's very uncomfortable. Especially, so I think about, I was raised like, you don't tell people your business. Your business is your business. You keep your family, like you keep your private stuff private. And I think from that, I'm already inherently a pretty private person, but there is like something like, well, if you show people these certain parts of you, they will judge you or they will reject you or they will talk about you. And I've seen that happen. I even see it happen today. Like, you know what I mean? In circles today. And that's uncomfortable. I know I personally don't like to feel like I'm being talked about or judged. And that fear of judgment has held me back, like kept me shrinking back for so long in my life. And so that as one haze, that is just easier said than done. It's uncomfortable. And so I don't know. What do you think? Are there some other hazes you can think of?
So I do believe that is the haze, but a bigger haze for me is like not living out my calling, right? And so the things that, and we talk about a lot about what we talk a lot about the things that we reject about religion, right? But I make no mistake, I respect everybody's higher power, but for me and my house, like we will serve the Lord. Like I love God, right? And I believe that God has called me to this work to be an example, to be able to be the person to use my voice, to be able to say that I survived this. I went through this. You can also.
Yeah.
And guilt and shame have no place there. Right. And so if I am the haze for me and what is scarier for me is to live this life not living out my calling because I'm shrinking back. When we pray before this podcast, we ask that God give us what we need to do this work, to be on this platform and give people what they need to navigate the journey. If we say those prayers and then shrink back because we are ashamed, then we're not doing what we're called to do. And it's scarier for me to live out this life and have not done what I am called to do, knowing what my calling is.
Yeah.
And believe that, it's that is the impact that we're supposed to leave on the world. Like you take your experience and you help somebody else navigate so they don't have to have the rough time that you had. And also so they know that they're not alone.
I hear you. I agree with you.
But I acknowledge that it's hard. Right. I acknowledge that it's hard, that is difficult, but that is what we're grateful to have the resources to be able to go to therapy. We're grateful for like this partnership so that, we have each other to be reminders that we are doing this work for, if it only ever helps us, we're grateful, right? If it only helps one other person, we are still grateful. If it only ever helps us to have the conversations with our families, who call and be like, I heard you say my name on the podcast. Why are you talking about me? But it initiates and is the catalyst for sometimes difficult discussions that we have to have, and if it only ever helps those few people, we'll be okay with that because that is a part of the work.
Is a requirement of shadow work that you have to share that, or can you address it for yourself with your therapist and maybe with the closest people to you? Is that enough? Is that also considered doing shadow work?
It's two different things.
What are two different things?
Like the requirement to share is something totally different. Like my calling, I believe, is to share like this journey. So it's a catalyst for other people to be comfortable with doing the work that they have to do. Shadow work is more for you to be able to like fully lean into who you really are and to understand that there is acceptance there, that there is creativity to be gleaned from that there's productivity to be gleaned from that, being able to accept even your talkative self. There are some of your words that you may have shrunk back that you feel like are too much that will be useful in the work that you do, right? And that's not to be shared with anybody else, but it is about showing up as your full self and that full self having a place in the world that is not like the retreat and being stowed away somewhere to be ashamed of.
Come on, stowed away. Love that choice of words.
Mm-hmm.
How do we navigate it? I mean, the only thing I'm thinking of is with a therapist. Like, I literally have no other. But actually, you know what? We're going to share an article on the actual website where we house most of our episodes. There's an article from betterup.com, and it has, I think, like 8 ways that you can do shadow work yourself. So basically, the whole premise of the article is that you don't have to have a therapist. It is highly recommended that you do. And there are lots of resources and organizations now where you can find therapy that's affordable, maybe even free in some instances. Just to reshare some networks that we've shared in previous episodes. We've shared therapy for Black girls before and Black Men Heal. If you go on psychologytoday.com, you can also find, so you can find professionals to help you through this. But there is also this article that gives some tips for how to do some shadow work on your own.
BetterHelp.com just in general is a great resource for, a lot of stuff. And because for some of us, it is just about, folks just don't jump into therapy, right? Sometimes folks just want to read about it a little bit and say, that may be something I want to take a look at. So those are some great, places to start from. But navigating through it is just like, having at baseline the idea that you are enough and that you are in process, and that in this moment I am opting to be better and not bitter. That I am not as concerned about the things about me that I feel like are unacceptable, because I can take all of that stuff, make a list, and beat myself up with it really good. But that all parts of me are useful in some way, and I need to find out like how I can not shrink, how I can, take all parts of me and operate in my whole self and be good.
I think for me also it's like not assigning meaning to mistakes that I've made or to parts of me that I might now think is like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Because I vividly remember moments in my 20s being like, you know what? I'm tired of playing it safe. I don't want to always like be a goody goody. I'm going to do this thing and, against what I was maybe taught or raised to do. And I'm going to be this rebel in this way. And then later in life being like, did I actually need to do that? And I remember thinking, though, at the time, like, I don't want to get to the end of my life and, like, my story be vanilla. And so I actively chose to color it with some other flavors, right? But then you get on this side of it, adulthood, and you're like, was it needed? Would I have been okay with the vanilla? Or would I be here regretting, like, I wish I had even just done the thing? So
nothing about you is vanilla, Jonathan.
You don't think so?
No, we need seasoning.
So we say that now, but do you know how many times I've been called a goody goody or a prude or all of these things just because I'm not out there like a lot of women or people are. Do you know what I mean? There are a lot of things I've not tried that a lot of people have, so I am on a safer side of of life. And to some people, that's not flavorful. That's boring. That's, even though I've done really interesting things, I've not been on the edge of life out here like some.
What is it to you though? But because I'm asking you that question because that's what shadow work is. Like it is like killing comparison. Like I'm not out there like some other people, right? To some people that's boring. What is it to you and the impact that you're supposed to make on the world?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that yet, but what I can tell you, I'm even listening, like having this conversation with you, I am resonating with or finding that I actually still am proud of me and who I'm becoming. I think about like moments of like small rejection, whereas rejection would have had me like shrink back even more and been like, oh, see, that's why I don't do stuff like that. But now I'm emboldened even to be like, this rejection, you reject, that's your bad. That's your loss.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because there's going to be a time when you're going to wish you had responded to this
Mm-hmm.
message, or you're going to, so I guess I'm finding or even sensing more strength, confidence in myself, love in myself, trust of myself, even from what I've done so far. And I definitely feel like there's a ways to go, because I'm still human. I feel the sting of those things.
Yeah.
Still feel it, the sting of rejection, but I haven't assigned any meaning to myself or my self-worth because of it. And that's radical for me.
Yeah, it's absolutely radical to be able to run your own race in your own lane and be okay with that. And for me, it requires sometimes for me to put blinders on, so I'm not worried about what everybody else is thinking and what everybody else is doing. And that is why I'm healing, right? Because that for so long, my worth and my sense of self and all those things were tied to what is everybody else doing, and will I be able to run in this circle? Can I be a person who can go and fit in every single place, right, and be accepted in all those places, but not making a space for my own self to be accepted if it's just me. If it's just me, will I be okay here? Do I like my damn self? Right? What part of me am I shrinking back? And do I know those parts of me enough to be able to reject them? Right? All of me is okay.
Do I know those parts enough to even reject them? That's interesting. I'll have to sit with that for a little bit. It's how much do you even know? What's the motivation behind the thing that we did, or the way that we showed up? What was
who told me I wasn't okay?
Yeah.
Who told me I wasn't enough? Who told me that you that part of you, go over there?
And why, if you're thinking back to just the idea of your child, our kids show up just freely who they are, and then learn to be something else because of the teachings that they get. So who are we to say as adults when a child gets here, how they're showing up, what you just chose to do? Think about our nephew pulling off all the things in the house. What part of him?
My music for the moment about to be nothing but.
What part of him, though? What, as an adult, we would want to say that's just bad behavior, but is it really? What part of him is just being curious or inquisitive? I mean, we don't want the house tore up, but
So then that is a cue, right? To be able to give him things that he can put together and take apart, and to lean into that, and not beat that part of him out that is curious about how things work and what it looks like when you take this apart. What does this gadget do? Why is this door stopper? Why am I attracted to this spring? Why do I want to take it apart and leave it everywhere in the house?
Take every one of them out. Yeah. So I guess I'm saying when my prayer, and I've thought about this a couple times over the past couple of weeks, I would hope that when we have kids, when they get here, that we allow them to teach us as much as we're teaching them, that we allow space for them to just show up. It makes me think about that episode of Black Love. So this last season of Black Love was just really good. I'm really sad that it's going off the air, especially before we had a chance to be on it. But this one couple, I forget their names, but I just so admired them, their humor, their connection. But the gentleman, the husband, was talking about taking their daughter to a princess party as a kid, and the child wanted to be a ninja instead. And so dad was like, hell yeah, be a ninja at the princess party, right? And then seeing them grow up, and they were preparing themselves for the child to come out and say that they were gay. Oh yeah, my child's probably gay. They had prepared themselves for that, had created space for that. And then the child comes and says, actually, no, I'm a boy. And the way that they approached that was such a beautiful thing. They went and did research all the way back to Native Americans and people who had multiple spirits, and they just educated themselves on the experience instead of rejecting how the child wanted to show up, instead of beating it out of them. And I just pray that we have that same type of approach when our children show up as who they are, even if it's scary or foreign to us. I just thought that was Just lovely, lovely.
Well, because
Parenting.
when you love someone, when you love a person, when you love, you become a student of,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the same, I pray that the same energy I had in like dating you and our courtship, becoming a student of you and learning the things that you like and you love and your reasons why will be the same energy that I bring to our children, like to
Mm-hmm.
be students of them and not to try to beat them and conform them to.
Mm-hmm.
Because even when I think about our episode about like reparenting my inner child, like trying being taught to like be the sports star that my dad didn't fully get to
Mm.
and not being allowed to explore those other things that was really who I
Yeah.
was like this rejection of what I really wanted, right? And what I really needed. And I don't want to be a person who like thinks that, well, your mama's smart, your daddy's smart, you need to be smart like us and you need to get bachelor's, master's, PhD, if that's not really who our children are, right? I want to be students of them and kind of lean into letting them figure out what it is that they're really good at instead of trying
Mm-hmm.
to beat it out of them or try to mold their minds into something that is acceptable to us.
Well, TBD on that. I pray that one day we have a whole slew of episodes where we're literally processing how to parent human beings. Stay tuned for that. And last question, what does it look like to fully accept all the parts of ourselves? What does it look like to have fully, like this is my shadow, this is who I am, the yin to my yang, and I love all of it. I don't have an answer because I'm still trying to get there.
Right. TBD on that shit too. It looks like just actively doing the work and being able to say to yourself like, I'm good with me.
You know what? I had a glimpse of it today. Yes, I'm good with me is exactly what I had a glimpse of. I have these memories of an old relationship, and I had processed it with our therapist, and she kind of gave me a perspective that allowed me to not like beat myself up for my experiences ever. I kind of was questioning how and why, and so anyways, I don't even know where it came from. It was like you're the choices you made in the past were not a mistake. I was able to look at myself and say, you know what? Like you for so long chose another person, and then you know what it's like to actually choose yourself
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of all this other stuff. Like that's badass. And so for the first time I was able to like have this reframing of past
Mm-hmm.
experience of my life out of my life. And what I think is even interesting about being able to have that reframing today out of the blue is that means that my therapist helped me plant the seeds to get there, and it didn't
Mm-hmm.
happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden after other impressions, conversations with my husband, seeing things like the Woman King in that journey of self acceptance and hearing other people's stories, somehow all of those seeds took root. And just this morning, out of the blue, I was able to come to a moment where I was like, "Oh no, you you a bad chick. Like you did that, and I love you for it." And I think that's a little bit what it's like. Like
Mm-hmm.
this part of you that you thought was shameful and not right and not better. One day you're like, no, that was beautiful, and I'm proud of you for it.
Mm-hmm. And that for me is gratitude, right? It is learning to be more mindful and, you know, having this level of self acceptance that makes us stop for a moment and just
Mm.
have gratitude because we can be so future focused sometimes. And so, like, when am I going to get there focused that we forget to have gratitude for the journey that we came and for the path that we carved out ourselves that is full of missteps and curves and ups and downs and ebbs and flows and all of those things to be able to be appreciative for the entire journey
Yeah.
itself and even for being prepared for the work ahead. Like I've done that part before, so I know how to do this.
Hmm.
And there will be other parts that will give me at least the foundational work for what I have to do moving forward. And there'll be greater challenges ahead, but I'm prepared for those things because of where I've been.
Amen. I love it. This was a good conversation. I'm glad we talked about it because, again, there's not a lot of conversation going on about inner shadows and doing shadow work. And I think it's important, going back to our community, especially, like being able to accept and love ourselves, all parts of ourselves, is revolutionary. And goddamn, I would love to be a part of that revolution. And I think this conversation is part of that. What's the music for this moment? What does it feel like?
So there's this song by Wale called Gemini.
It's so good, y'all.
Such a great song. And he's really talking about this woman that he's talking to, right? And there's like two parts of her, and he is learning to basically love her, both parts of her. The parts of her that almost seem opposite, like you want this thing, but then you do this thing. But, really like loving both parts, two different portions, but I love it all, right? So that Gemini, that portion, loving our full selves and all of the contradictions sometimes that we are, and all parts of us. Like it's like, yeah, I'm this and I'm that, at the right time of day. I can accept that and reject that, but I accept all parts of me, even when it looks like the total opposite.
Yeah, that made me think of Donnell Jones. He also has a song called Gemini. I guess Gemini in Me. Split personalities. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde with me. Yeah, that it's just acknowledging like there's actually two sides of me. And I think it's important to also remind folks you had a song like early, maybe season 1. Who's the artist? The Ugly Parts of Me.
Avery Sunshine.
Avery Sunshine. I think that's on point for this.
Yeah,
too.
Avery Sunshine, The Ugly Parts of Me. I used to love that song.
So it's already on the Music for the Moment, but Spotify Music for the Moment playlist, we got all these songs, and they are all bangers. Really good playlist, y'all. So check it out. And speaking of checking things out, if you are joining us from YouTube, please like this video, subscribe to our channel. You'll get notifications when new episodes are released every 2 weeks before everybody else. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple or Google Podcasts, wherever you're tuning in from, please rate us and follow. Yeah, we just appreciate the support and the love and the feedback. We'd love to hear what we want to unpack. Feel free to email us at thelovehaze@gmail.com. Otherwise, like we always say, life is going to life. Life will always present you with a haze, but we have everything that we need within us to navigate through it.
Absolutely. And, no matter what, we're going to navigate this thing together. So we appreciate y'all joining us this time. We look forward to y'all joining us next time and every time.
Every time.
Well, that's it, y'all. Peace and love always.
Holla.
Holla.